Welcome back to another episode of Focus on K-12 EdTech and the Education Experience. I'm your host, Doug Konopelko, Education Strategist at CDWG. Since March 2020, it's fair to say that we've experienced significant disruption in the world of education. Most of what we know and find familiar has changed. Today, I talk with thought leader, educator, and author Eric Sheninger about his new book, Disruptive Thinking in Our Classroom. It describes ways that educators and leaders can create a culture of disruptive thinking that creates the foundation for success and innovation in our schools. Let's dive in.
My name is Eric Sheninger, and I'm an associate partner with the International Center for Leadership and Education. Prior to this role, I was a science teacher and a principal in the state of New Jersey. And the irony is, I should be the last person speaking to you, writing books, working with schools, because when I was a principal, I had the fixed mindset and I didn't believe in anything that my school eventually did or that I work with schools and districts now across the country and across the world. And I think when we think about change, there's usually defining moments that get us to really critically reflect on why do we do things the way we do them and how can we get better. For me, it was when I was running through my school in 2009 because a student broke our cell phone policy and I was pathetic. I was a bully. I ran him down. I was fast at that time because I was in my 30s. And I said, give me a device. And he thanked me for creating a jail out of what should be a school. That really got me thinking, what is my purpose in education? Because I am not serving those that I'm tasked with helping, which were my students. Then that weekend, I read an article about Twitter in the newspaper. And I got on social media, again, after swearing I never would. And social media really gave me a better lens that basically helped me come to the realization, oh my goodness, we're not as good as we thought. We can be better. And those 2 points in time helped shape my shift from a fixed to a growth mindset. And pretty much the rest is history.
All right, so along the way, you've written a few books, written a ton of articles, done a lot of, keynotes and speaking engagements and things like that, about your journey, which, like you said, really kind of started once you realized you needed to shift that mindset. And the most recent of which is next to me here, right? So disruptive thinking in our classrooms. And one of the things that you go into, right, in the idea of building relationships, like you said with that student where you had sort of clashed, and we all have so many of those stories, right, where we sort of were doing what we thought we should do at the time when we were leading schools or district work. But you talk a lot about trust, empathy, and relationships. So how does that play a part in disruptive thinking in our classrooms, this idea of trust, empathy, and relationships?
Yeah, Doug, relationships underpin everything. If there's no trust, there's no relationship. If there's no relationship, no real learning occurs. And, we've heard a lot during the pandemic, Maslow before Bloom's. And that holds true when we think about culture. You know, students, learners want to have a sense of value, meaning, purpose. And those interactions that we have with our kids are so important, especially if we want to get them to dive deep into the curriculum and develop all of these competencies that are going to help them be successful now and in the future. But a lot of how we build those relationships really comes down to how we structure our lessons and how we really do two things. How we empower our kids to think and apply their thinking in relevant and meaningful ways. But it's hard to get kids to think and apply their thinking if they don't have that greater sense of purpose. One of the best ways to instill that is through relevance. And when we think about not just district and school culture, but classroom culture, when kids get done every day, they should be able to realize, why did I learn this? How will I use it outside of school? And what will tell me if I am successful? There's no sort of recipe or blueprint for building relationships, but as you mentioned, empathy, putting ourselves in the shoes of our learners and trying to look through their lens gives us invaluable insight on how to do what we already do better.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think had a conversation recently with Chris Emdin. He talks about reality pedagogy, right? And teaching within the realities that our students are living in, right? So that empathy plays a huge part in, I think the popular phrase is sort of meeting students where they are, right? But empathy, understanding what they're going through and using that to feed forward in the work.
Exactly. And, when we talk about, sort of meeting them where they are, we have to look at the world. The fourth industrial revolution prior to the pandemic, which is still here, the pandemic, disruptive change is the new normal. And if we are to help our kids be successful, we need to develop their ability to think disruptively. But in order to do that, we must examine and reflect on our current teaching and learning practices. And in a sense, educators have to become disruptive thinkers themselves. What does that mean? What is disruptive thinking? It's about replacing conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems. So, as we talk about relationships, we talk about empathy, if we're truly embodying that, our duty is to prepare kids to be these disruptive thinkers so that no matter what is thrown at them in the near future or even going forward, they are going to have that vast set of competencies, a toolbox to be the next generation of thinkers, doers, inventors, explorers that we desperately need.
Absolutely. And with everything that we're going through right now, I think saying that it's uncomfortable would be an understatement, right? So, another theme that you talk about in the book is this idea of getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And for those of us who are in education, with all the shifts that happen every year, right, whether it be legislative or pedagogical, right, any of those things, can you tell us about a time in your education journey where you really had to rumble with that idea of, getting comfortable being uncomfortable?
Oh man, we could be here for a while because that is just the embedded thread in my professional career. And one theme in chapter 2 of the book is how comfort is the enemy of growth. And I think often we are blinded by our own bias. We have a sense that, hey, things are going well because we have great test scores, or our stakeholders are leaving us alone, or hey, people are just leaving us alone. For me, it comes back to the original story that I led with, which was our archaic jail-like policies and procedures that I did not want to change because we often teach the way we were taught, we lead the way we were led, and I thought my job was creating a safe, optimal learning environment free of distraction. No way were my kids going to have access to social media in my school. No way were they going to use their devices, and we were going to clamp down. And that's something that I rumbled with for a long time because I not only had a fixed mindset, but I was, sort of driven by this perception that's not a teaching and learning culture. And, not only did that student help me change my perspective, but then I had to learn how to unlearn and relearn. I had to remove bias. I had to become more empathetic. But as the principal, I had to put my teachers in a position where they were able to break away from comfort, move past fear in order to embrace and implement innovative change with fidelity. You know, as the saying goes, you get what you model. And I don't care what the change is. If you're not doing it, others most likely are not going to do it as well. So I think that, as we grapple with comfort and fear, that sort of resilience, setting ourselves up to be vulnerable, in the end, those are two critical elements to create a disruptive thinking and learning culture, because schools should reflect the world that our kids live in, that they will work in, that they will personalize in. And that's something that we had to grapple with many, many years ago. And thankfully we did.
Absolutely. So there's something about education and leadership folks that we love. We love a good quote, right? So there's a lot of good inspirational quotes in the book as well, which I know educators really flock to because they feel like, okay, this can apply to my work, even though it wasn't about the work, right? So one of the ones that you use in the book, you state, as Teddy Roosevelt once said, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So working in and around education for the last decade plus, I've heard that quote many, many times. And it absolutely applies to the work and goes back to what you talked about with relationships. But the question I want to ask you is, in 40 years, right, how do you hope people are finishing the following phrase? As Eric Sheninger once said,
All learners have greatness hidden inside of them. It's the job of an educator to help them find and unleash that greatness. And I think that really, when we think about education, it's a calling to help kids. I became a teacher because of how Mr. South in seventh and eighth grade, because I went to a very rural school in New Jersey, I had him twice. Mr. South unleashed, interest, passion, talents in relation to science that I never knew that I had. And I think that if we remember, our why do we teach? Why do we lead? And that answer should always come back to those who we serve. Education is a profession of service. We serve our learners, even as frustrating sometimes they can make us. But that is how I would hope people would remember me, because my whole job is, I don't have all the answers. No one does. And my job isn't to tell people what to do. The premise of disruptive thinking in our classrooms is to get people to think critically about why did they teach or lead the way they do? How can they do it better? And what will tell them if they're successful? I want people to challenge their own conventional thinking in order to unleash their greatness so that they can do the same for their learners.
absolutely. So the last 16 months, I think we're at 16 months, 14 months, have been very interesting through the pandemic, right? Especially being in the world of education, where people have had to step up in ways that we never thought education and educators were going to have to step up. So you work with education systems and districts and leaders, all over the world as they've navigated this last year or so. So, what are some of the most successful or impressive examples of disruptive thinking in the classroom that you've seen? Shout out some of those game changers.
Oh, and that is tough as well, because my hat's off to every single educator, teacher, administrator, support staff, bus driver, custodian, everyone, because all of them were building the plane and flying at the same time. And what they showed us is that a virus, a pandemic, can not stop their commitment to kids. And when I look at success, I feel that I have seen the most scalable, innovative change in such a short period of time in my whole educational career. And when I look at schools that are doing it successfully, some were doing it well before the pandemic, such as Wells Elementary School here in my home district in Cy-Fair, Texas. You talk about blended learning, not blended instruction. Blended instruction is what the teacher does with technology. Blended learning is where kids use tech to control some aspect of path, pace, and place. They were doing it well before the pandemic, and that served their students even better now. I look at the Corinth School District in Corinth, Mississippi. I mean, their sort of focus on how they have leveraged their learning management system, in their sense, Canvas, whether they were remote or hybrid, to keep learning seamless, making sure that there's continuity and consistency. So if a student goes out on quarantine, they are still able to have equitable access to all of their resources. I look at two different school districts in Utah, Davis Schools and the JUAB School District, where they have embraced personalized learning at scale. A fundamental shift from what we teach, what's in the curriculum, what's on the test, to who, to emphasize ownership of learning. And when you look at what they have been able to do, equity is about all kids getting what they need when and where they need it. And those two districts have been able to scale that work. But, Doug, when I think about all the successes, I see schools, classrooms, schools, districts using time better, putting the well-being of students and staff first, focusing on continuous improvement, embracing learning management systems for how they're really supposed to be used, innovating in ways that were not happening prior. But I think the one lesson that we've learned is that learning has to be about people. And that interaction and collaboration, whether it's face-to-face or digital, has only become more of an emphasis now.
Absolutely. Eric, I want to thank you for your time today. Really love, your energy and the work you put out there.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us today on Focus on K-12 EdTech and the Education Experience. If you enjoyed today's show, please feel free to like, subscribe, and click the little bell so that you get notified whenever we post a new episode. Or reach out to me on Twitter @dconopelco. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time as we focus on K-12.